The rain hammered relentlessly against the tall windows of the Sterling mansion as Maxwell. Sterling stood motionless in his mahogany-paneled study, surrounded by silver-framed photographs of his late wife, Carolyn. 3 long years had passed since the devastating car accident that took her from him, leaving him alone with their 7-year-old daughter, Emma, in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The grand rooms echoed with silence, and despite all the expensive furnishings, original paintings, and luxurious carpets, the mansion felt emptier with each passing day. Emma had completely stopped speaking after witnessing her mother's death, retreating into an impenetrable world of silence that no therapist, specialist, or doctor could breach. Maxwell had exhausted every option. He'd hired the best child psychologists in the country, changed schools 3 times, even took Emma on extended vacations hoping new environments would help her heal. Nothing worked. His daughter remained locked in her silent prison, and Maxwell felt increasingly helpless watching her fade away. That's when Sophie Morrison arrived 6 months ago, responding to his advertisement for a nanny. She was young, only 22, with kind hazel eyes and an inexplicable warmth that seemed to radiate from her very being. Within the first weeks, something miraculous began happening. Emma, who hadn't responded to anyone since Caroline's death, started showing small signs of life around Sophie. A slight smile when Sophie read to her. A gentle nod when Sophie asked questions. Even holding Sophie's hand during their walks through the estate's sprawling gardens. For the first time in 3 years, Maxwell felt a flicker of hope that his daughter might find her way back to the world of the living. Sophie had been working for the Sterling family for exactly 6 months when Maxwell first noticed something peculiar about her routine. Every single evening at precisely 6 o'clock, like clockwork, Sophie would politely excuse herself from the mansion, decline his standing offer of having his driver take her home, and walk down the tree-lined street regardless of weather conditions, rain, shine, or occasional snow. She always carried the same 2 worn canvas shopping bags with her. Bags that had clearly seen better days with frayed handles and faded fabric. What struck Maxwell most was the dramatic shift in her demeanor the moment she prepared to leave. The warm, patient caregiver who spent hours playing with Emma, reading stories in funny voices, and coaxing smiles from his silent daughter would transform into someone guarded. Almost anxious, her shoulders tensing as she glanced at the clock. Maxwell told himself repeatedly that it wasn't his business, that Sophie's personal life was entirely her own, that he had no right to pry into her private affairs. But curiosity gnawed at him with increasing intensity. Just last week, Emma had drawn her first picture since Caroline's death, a simple crayon drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands, one tall and one small, with Sophie and me, written in Emma's careful 7-year-old handwriting. His daughter was finally healing, emerging from her cocoon of grief and trauma, and Sophie was the catalyst for this miracle. Maxwell needed to understand the woman who had accomplished what teams of expensive professionals could not. Who was Sophie Morrison, really? What was in those bags? Where did she go every evening with such urgency? On a particularly drizzly Thursday evening in late autumn, Maxwell made a decision that would alter the course of all their lives forever. He would follow Sophie, waiting until she left the mansion at her customary 6 o'clock departure. Maxwell grabbed his expensive cashmere coat and followed at a discreet distance, keeping far enough back that she wouldn't notice him but close enough to track her movements. He watched as she walked briskly through their affluent neighborhood with its manicured lawns, luxury cars, and historic homes, then continued into progressively less wealthy areas of the city. The transition was stark. Mansion-lined streets gave way to modest houses, then apartment complexes, then areas Maxwell barely recognized despite having lived in this city his entire life. Sophie stopped at a small, cramped grocery store wedged between a laundromat and a check-cashing business. Through the streaked window, Maxwell watched her carefully select items with methodical precision, a loaf of bread, checking the price twice, a gallon of milk, choosing the store brand, several cans of vegetables, comparing costs per ounce. She counted her money carefully before approaching the register, her lips moving as she calculated. When the total rang up, Maxwell saw her face fall slightly. She asked the cashier to remove a small container of fresh strawberries, apologizing quietly. His chest tightened painfully watching this scene unfold. This was the same woman who had refused every raise he'd offered over the past 6 months, insisting firmly that her current salary was more than generous, more than enough for her needs. Yet here she was, counting pennies and putting back fruit because she couldn't afford it. What was going on? Where was her money going? Sophie's journey continued deeper into a rundown neighborhood Maxwell had never visited, though he realized with shame it was only 5 miles from his gated estate. She stopped at a decrepit apartment building that looked like it should have been condemned. Years ago, broken exterior lights dangling from wires, graffiti covering every available surface, windows covered with cardboard or torn curtains, concrete stairs crumbling at the edges. Maxwell positioned himself across the street beneath a flickering streetlight, expensive coat soaking through from the persistent drizzle, and watched as Sophie climbed the exterior stairs to the 3rd floor, her canvas bags obviously heavy now. Through a window with ripped curtains barely hanging on a sagging rod, he could see directly into a tiny apartment. 3 children, none older than Emmer, rushed to the door the moment it opened, their faces lighting up with pure joy. They threw their arms around Sophie, nearly knocking her backwards with the force of their enthusiasm. She embraced them with the same natural warmth and genuine affection she showed his daughter, kneeling down to their level, kissing foreheads, stroking hair. Then she began unpacking the groceries with visible relief, as if she'd been worried about getting enough food. An elderly woman sat motionless in a battered wheelchair positioned by the window, her face turned toward the reunion scene. Sophie went to her immediately, kneeling beside the wheelchair, gently brushing the woman's gray hair back from her weathered face, speaking words Maxwell couldn't hear but could see were full of love. The profound realization hit him like a physical blow. Sophie wasn't just his employee working to support herself, she was the sole provider caring for an entire family on the modest salary she earned at his home, *. Maxwell stood rooted to that spot across the street for over an hour, unable to tear his eyes away from the illuminated window, watching a scene that would be forever burned into his memory. He observed Sophie make dinner for the children in a kitchen so impossibly small she could barely turn around without bumping into something. A tiny 2-burner stove, a refrigerator that hummed loudly and probably barely worked, cabinets hanging crooked on the walls. The 3 children sat at a rickety folding table doing homework while Sophie moved between them with practiced efficiency, helping one child with multiplication problems, then shifting to assist another struggling with reading comprehension, then checking the 3rd child's spelling words, all while stirring something on the stove and keeping an eye on the elderly woman. There was no television, no computer, barely any furniture beyond the absolute essentials, a threadbare couch with visible springs, that folding table, mismatched chairs, the wheelchair. Yet despite the poverty, despite the cramped quarters and obvious deprivation, the apartment radiated more genuine warmth and love than Maxwell's 10,000-square-foot mansion had felt in 3 years. Sophie never stopped moving, cooking, cleaning, helping with homework, bringing water to her mother, wiping down counters, checking backpacks for school notices. When the youngest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6, hugged Sophie tightly around the waist, Sophie's composed face crumpled for just a brief moment, revealing exhaustion so bone-deep and profound it made Maxwell's heart physically ache in his chest. Then she quickly composed herself, kissed the child's forehead tenderly, whispered something that made the little girl giggle, and continued her never-ending work. This was Sophie's reality. This was where she went every evening after caring for his daughter all day, *. The next morning arrived gray and cold, and Maxwell found himself unable to meet Sophie's eyes when she arrived at the mansion at her usual 7:30 start time. She greeted him with her customary professional warmth, that genuine smile that never seemed forced, asking courteously about his night, whether he'd slept well, if Emma had woken during the night, whether he needed anything before she went upstairs to wake his daughter. Everything about her demeanor was composed, cheerful, dedicated, the consummate professional. Yet Maxwell now saw what he'd somehow missed before, the dark shadows under her eyes that no amount of concealer could fully hide, the slight tremor in her hands from obvious exhaustion, the way she discreetly stretched her back when she thought no one was looking, the careful way she moved as if her whole body ached. How had he been so blind? She worked 10-hour days at his home, pouring energy and attention into Emma's care, then went home to work through the entire night for her own family. She probably slept 4 or 5 hours at most. During Emma's afternoon nap, Maxwell found Sophie sitting alone in the kitchen, quietly eating a simple sandwich she'd brought from home in a worn lunch bag, despite his repeated insistence over months that she help herself to anything in the house, the fully stocked refrigerator, the pantry filled with expensive foods, the fresh fruit always available. She never took more than she absolutely needed, never asked for anything beyond her salary, never complained about anything. When he'd offered her overtime pay for staying late when he had business dinners, she'd refuse, saying she was just happy to help. Now he understood. She couldn't stay late because her family was waiting, depending on her, needing her to come home and take care of them, that evening. Maxwell made a decision. He asked his driver to prepare the car and waited by the vehicle when 6 o'clock approached. When Sophie emerged from the mansion's front entrance at her usual time, canvas bags in hand, he was standing there waiting. "Sophie, please, let me give you a ride home," he said, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. She froze instantly, alarm flashing visibly across her face, her whole body going rigid. "Mr. Sterling, that's really not necessary at all. I enjoy the walk, truly. The fresh air helps me think, and the exercise is good for me," she said quickly, words tumbling out in a rush. But Maxwell gently insisted, and after several tense moments of obvious internal struggle, she reluctantly agreed, though her hands clutched those canvas bags so tightly her knuckles turned white. As they drove through the dramatically changing neighborhoods, from manicured estates to modest homes to increasingly poor areas, Sophie sat rigidly upright in the leather seat, answering his gentle, carefully phrased questions with growing reluctance and one-word responses when possible. Her anxiety was palpable, filling the car's interior. When they finally reached her building and the driver pulled to the curb, she thanked him hurriedly and moved to exit quickly, clearly desperate to escape. But Maxwell asked softly, his voice full of compassion rather than accusation, "Those are your siblings, aren't they? And your mother in the wheelchair?" Sophie's eyes immediately filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks. She nodded slowly, unable to speak, her throat working as she tried to compose herself. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked gently. Sophie's voice broke completely as she replied, tears flowing freely now. "Because people like you don't hire people like us when they know how desperate we really are. We scare you away." Sophie finally told him everything, the whole devastating story pouring out in broken sentences between tears. Her father had died suddenly of a massive heart attack when she was only 19 years old, just starting her sophomore year of college, where she'd been studying early childhood education on a partial scholarship. In an instant, she became the sole provider for her 3 younger siblings, ages 6, 9, and 11 at the time, and her mother, who had suffered a severe, debilitating stroke just 2 months after her father's death, losing most of her mobility and requiring constant care. The medical bills were catastrophic. They lost their modest family home within 6 months. Their savings evaporated paying for her mother's rehabilitation and medications. Everything disappeared. Sophie had dropped out of college immediately, abandoning her dreams of becoming a teacher, to take any job she could find that would support her family. She'd worked retail, waitress, double shifts, cleaned houses, anything that paid. Being a nanny paid significantly better than her other options and used her natural skills with children, but the salary, while generous by her standards, was never quite enough. The apartment cost 70% of her income. Food, her mother's medications, school supplies, and clothes for the constantly growing kids. Utilities, it consumed everything and more. She walked to work every day, a 90-minute journey each way, to save bus fare. She brought lunch from home, carefully rationed leftovers. She never turned on the heating in their apartment until the children were literally shivering. I can't lose this job, Sophie whispered desperately, her face wet with tears. Emma needs me, I know she does, but my family needs me even more. If you fire me because of this, because you think I'm not focused enough or professional enough, I honestly don't know what we'll do.